Good morning. How's everyone doing today? Well, I'm Tim Brewster, so we have little back feed right here. I'm Tim Brewster from National Interstate Insurance, and I oversee the field operations for our risk management department. One, it's an absolute pleasure being at the California Bus Association, and it's always nice having an opportunity to educate my peers on the root cause analysis process. We actually created this presentation because more often than not, when we go out and consult with customers, we realized they weren't getting to the root cause of their accidents or injuries, and they were continuing to have reoccurrences, and we wanted to help them prevent that from happening. So today I'm going to spend 15 or 20 minutes going through the root cause analysis process, and then we're going to break into a hands-on accident investigation activity where you'll work with your peers to determine what the root cause of the loss is. As I go through this, if you have any questions, feel free to ask. Can everyone see me all right? Because I'm not a big fan of standing behind a podium. I like walking around while I present. Yes. Are we good? Perfect. Larry? Can everyone see the screen though? Because it is a little faded. We're good? Okay, exactly. What screen? That's the thing I love about Monday morning presentations. You know right away whether the crowd's re-energized from the weekend or they're still trying to recover from the weekend. So I'm hoping everyone has a lot of energy today. So what is a root cause? You have multiple definitions that flow throughout the safety industry. And I have a definition up here from the American Association for Laboratory Accreditation, but I don't want you to focus on that. I want you to focus on me. Because my number one goal today is to help provide everyone with the skill set to be able to conduct an effective root cause analysis. But in order to do that, you have to understand what a root cause is. And the reason I don't want you to focus on that definition is I want to break it into even more of a simplistic meaning, because root cause automatically has a negative connotation to it. It's something that should be part of an investigation, but typically isn't, because people are intimidated. They don't know where to start their investigation. All of root cause is an event that contributed to or created the proximate cause of a loss, and if eliminated, we're not going to continue to have losses. Again, all of root cause is an event that contributed to or created the proximate cause of a loss, and if eliminated, we're not going to continue to have the same types of losses. There's one thing I do want you to take away from this definition, and that's the last sentence. Typically, multiple root causes contribute to an undesired outcome. So there's not necessarily anything that says there can only be one root cause. There are often multiple root causes to a loss, and if not eliminated, we're going to continue to have the same types of losses.
What's the root cause?
Well, someone asked me, should we change the batteries, and I said it was working this morning, but we should have changed the batteries. So I'm going to go to the keyboard. So all losses will either have one root cause or multiple root causes, and they'll either have a contributing factor or multiple contributing factors. So these two words are used interchangeably throughout the industry, but they shouldn't be because they're very different from each other. A root cause is also known as the underlying causation factor. If we eliminate it, we're not going to continue to have the same types of losses due to these same circumstances. Where a contributing factor is exactly as it sounds. It contributed to the loss, but it's not the true cause. If we eliminate it for that loss, we're probably not going to continue to have, we wouldn't have that same loss over and over, but we'll still have losses due to these same circumstances. To put this in a context, take something as simple as a water fountain on a hot summer day in a hallway. Condensation builds up on the pipe. It puddles up on the floor. Someone walks through the hallway, slips on the water, injures themselves. What do we typically do? We have a janitor wipe the water up and put a sign to warn people that the floor is wet. All we've done there is eliminated a contributing factor, because if we would have wiped that water up prior to someone walking through the hallway, would have we ever had that slip injury? Absolutely not. We need to identify how do we prevent the water from being on the floor in the beginning, and then we're not going to continue to have the same types of losses, because tomorrow that puddle is going to be on the floor again and someone's going to be injured. You can also use this visual down here, the domino effect. All the way to your right is the loss. That's where all good investigations start. All the way to the left is the root cause. What do you think all these dominoes in between are? They're contributing factors. We don't want to overlook these because they're a vital part of our investigation. We want to eliminate them as we investigate, But a lot of investigations stop somewhere in the middle. We think we've determined a solution, we've implemented it, but what we realize later is we continue to have the same types of losses. Because if we pull that middle domino out, is that first one going to eventually fall again? Absolutely. So if you think you've identified what the root cause is, take a step back, get someone else's perspective, because you may not have. Because a lot of times we only address the contributing factors, and that's why we have the same types of losses over and over. So what are examples of root causes? So we have common themes up here that we hear throughout the industry. A lot of individuals would tell you, these are causes of losses, and I'm not disputing that, but these aren't root causes. These are what I would consider direct causes or contributing factors. Because if we continue to go in with the mindset that our employee rear-ended someone, let's put them through training to correct that deficiency, and that's all we do, are we eventually going to have that same type of loss again? Absolutely. I want to know, why did our employee rear-end someone else? Were they distracted? Did we not provide them with the skill set initially upon hire to drive defensively? When's the last time we provided them with recurrent training on defensive driving techniques? Could have we potentially identified this unsafe behavior that's been taking place for 30, 60, or 90 days through GPS or automatic event recorders, but we failed to do so due to time constraints within our operation? We need to keep asking these probing questions, because if we just throw training at someone and hope that corrects the issue, we may be setting ourselves up for failure, because what if a deficient skill set isn't what caused the loss, but there's something else that's underlying there? The same thing with the employee was struck by a vehicle. These are often overlooked throughout the industry when we're struck by other vehicles, because we think to ourselves, not preventable, not at fault. And maybe they have small severity because the other party pays for the loss. So we typically don't conduct nearly as thorough of an investigation. But I look at this, it's our biggest opportunity for improvement, because if we can find a system failure within our operation when we have a small loss, let's correct it before it results in that large loss. I was at a customer's location a few months ago, and we were discussing losses. It was a motor coach customer, and they had multiple losses where they were struck by their vehicles. Very little investigation took place, and they deemed them not at fault, non-preventable. As we started digging through their losses, we realized over 75% of their losses, when they were being struck by other vehicles, guess what? The bus was empty. The only person on the bus was the driver. You think that's coincidental, or do you think a different type of behavior is coming out when the bus is unloaded, no passengers? If we don't cross-reference documentation and review our losses when they're minor like that, we're going to eventually have that large loss. At least now they know what direction to head to address the exposure throughout their operation. You know, the employee was fatigued. This is another example. Often when I review accident investigations, we say the employee fell asleep at the wheel. We either fire them. Well, if we fire them, guess what? Someone else is going to fall asleep at the wheel. Or we put them through training on fatigue management. But I want to know, why did they fall asleep? Did they not get a good night's rest? Do they have secondary employment that we don't know about? Do we have policies on secondary employment? Are we monitoring their secondary employment if they do? Maybe they have sleep apnea. Is this part of our screening process for pre-employment? If not, maybe that's something that we should incorporate into our hiring process. And every 2 years when they get a new DOT physical, because it is the discretion of the medical examiner. Last thing we want to do is realize a lot of our drivers have sleep apnea. That's why they're fatigued while they're driving, and then they're involved in a loss. We need to keep digging, otherwise we're not going to get to the underlying causation factors and be able to prevent these types of losses. So we have several examples up here of what a root cause could be. And this isn't an exhaustive list by any means, and I'm not going to go through every single bullet point, but we're going to hit on a couple of them. Number one is training. If we don't have any training in place, that could absolutely be a root cause. But if we have training in place, I want to know right away, is it effective? Is it addressing the types of exposures that exist throughout our operation? If not, we need to reevaluate. How often do you go into a location and you realize they've had the same training for the past 3, 4, 5 years and no modifications have been made? My concern is, has the environment changed over the past 4 or 5 years? Has the driver pool changed over the past 4 or 5 years? Have our vehicles changed? It likely has. So our training also needs to evolve with the environment that we operate in. I was at a customer's location again. This one was probably a few months ago, and they had a great orientation program, great recurrent training program, quarterly safety meetings. And we were reviewing their losses, and 9 out of their 10 losses involved employees that had not been attending, guess what? The quarterly safety meetings. So right there is a commonality throughout their organization. Did they realize that? No. The unfortunate thing is, one, they realized too late. They've already had 9 losses due to that, and they hadn't done anything about it. So the root cause, is it the training? No, that's a contributing factor, because if we require those 9 people to attend the quarterly safety meetings, what about all the other people throughout our organization? If they're not attending, they're going to eventually be involved in losses too, because they're lacking the skill set. The root cause in that example was not having a quality assurance process in place to verify people are attending our safety meetings like they're required to. So we have policies and procedures. Either we don't have policies and procedures in place because we assume employees know how to perform their job safely, or we have policies and procedures in place, but they're outdated. We don't update them regularly when we implement changes throughout our organization. One thing I see a lot with policies and procedures, great manuals, 100 pages, 200 pages, but when you get that large of a manual, do you think there's clarity there where everyone understands what policies exist throughout our organization? Typically not. And what you see, people aren't enforcing them. They're not following them. You may have a policy, but that's not the norm throughout our organization. So that's something we need to reevaluate. I'm more concerned about effectiveness, not quantity. The one thing that I saw with a customer, this one was a few years ago, as we were reviewing losses with their management team and their safety committee, we looked at one pretty simplistic loss. It was a slip, trip, and fall in the parking lot. And I asked the customer, what caused that slip, trip, and fall? They said the root cause is the employee was wearing flip-flops. I thought to myself, that's not the root cause, that's a contributing factor. Because I said, what about the next employee that wears flip-flops? My next question was, do we have a policy on proper footwear? What do you think they said? Yeah, we have a policy. I asked, was that the first time that employee had worn flip-flops? No. Was management aware? What do you think the answer was? Yeah, management was aware. So where do you think the root cause comes into play? Management not holding employees accountable. It wasn't the fact that the employee was wearing flip-flops. Again, that's just a contributing factor. And unfortunately, I don't like to say this, and a lot of people don't like to hear it, but management is often the root cause of losses because we have so much power and control within our hands, but we overlook things, and we like to place blame back on the employee when it wasn't necessarily the employee. We created a negative safety culture where they weren't following policies, and the norm was to wear flip-flops if they wanted to. So those are things that you have to think about. The last one I want to hit on within this slide is the job hazard analysis, also known as the job safety analysis. This is big through the Occupational Safety and Health Administration. All a job safety analysis is taking a job or taking a task and breaking it down into individual steps. With those steps, you also list the exposures. What could potentially go wrong that would result in injury? After we identify that, we want to put control measures in place for each step. My question for management is, if we're not conducting a job safety analysis and we don't know the occupational exposures associated with different jobs throughout our organization, how do we expect our employees to? We don't want to assume they know how to perform their job safely because they have 20 years experience. We want to know. So if we're not conducting a job safety analysis for different positions throughout our organization, that's something that we need to reevaluate because a lot of injuries are caused by not knowing what exposures are there, so they don't know how to control them. So there are multiple methods to getting to the root cause of a loss, and I'm going to go through a couple today. The first one is more of a systematic approach. It's up here. You have 4 different categories: people, equipment material, processes, and environment. Your root cause can come from one category or multiple categories, because remember that definition in the beginning, that last sentence. There's often more than one root cause per loss. So if I have a loss, the first thing I want to do is look at people. I want to know, did we hire the right person to begin with? Unfortunately, sometimes we hire the wrong person. We let something slip through the cracks because we needed to fill a seat. We don't want to do that, and we don't want to realize after we have a loss, they should have never been behind the wheel of a vehicle. How am I going to verify whether or not I hired the right person? I'm going to go back and look at my hiring criteria. I'm going to look at the driver qualification file. I need to verify that. I'm not just going to say, yeah, John's been a great driver for the past 2 years. I need to actually look at the file to verify whether or not they meet our hiring criteria and if there were any red flags. So say we hire the right person. Next thing I want to know, did we train them properly? Initially upon hire, on a recurrent basis, were they provided with the skill set to operate successfully within the environment? So we hire the right person, we train them properly. The last thing I want to know, did we lead them properly as leaders? Because unfortunately, sometimes we set people up for failure, whether we want to believe it or not. Think of the example with the flip-flops. We didn't lead them properly by not enforcing the policies throughout our organization. Or if we just have someone sign off on the policy and procedure manual and assume that they read everything, are we setting them up for failure to an extent? Yeah, especially if it's a 200 or 300 page policy and procedure manual. So if we hire them, we hire the right person, we train them properly, we led them properly, the next thing I want to go to is the equipment and material. The first thing is, do we have the right equipment and material to perform the job safely? If we don't have the right equipment and material, we're not going to perform the job safely. We're going to eventually have a loss. Take something as simple as tires throughout the shop. If we're dismounting, mounting, and inflating tires, and we don't have a tire cage, can we do it safely? No. We may not have an injury if we do it 100 or 200 times, but eventually that tire is going to fail, it's going to explode, it's going to throw the mechanic back. So we want to know whether or not we have the right equipment for people to perform the job safely. If we have the right equipment, the next thing we want to know, are people utilizing the equipment? We have equipment all the time throughout the shop that's being used for what it's not made for. You use a tire cage as an example. We have tire cages in the shop, but how often do you go into a shop and people aren't utilizing the tire cage? Happens every single day. And when are we going to make a change? Unfortunately, after we have a loss. So if we have the right equipment, we're utilizing it properly, the last thing I want to know is, are we maintaining it? Lack of maintenance often results in injury or accidents. Are we maintaining our buses properly? Are we maintaining the machine guarding on our abrasive wheels? Are we checking our eye wash stations regularly to ensure that they're clean? If not, it's going to eventually result in some type of accident or injury. I'll be the first to admit, under the equipment and material category, I've changed a light bulb at home using a chair. Unfortunately, I don't like to admit that. And everyone does it. But that is not what the equipment is made for. You should use a step stool or a ladder. When do people typically quit using ladders at home to change light bulbs? After they fall, after they have a near miss. And the last thing we want to do is to have a loss, then realize we need to make changes. So the third thing is processes. I want to know, do we have the proper policies and procedures in our organization to set people up for success? This could be something as simple as, we used to outsource all of our tire work, but we decided we're going to take it in-house to save money. We're worried about that bottom line. Well, before we take the tire work in-house, do we have a process in place to ensure that we're conducting a job safety analysis so we know the exposures associated with it, to ensure that we have the right equipment, such as a tire cage? If we don't have processes like this throughout our organization to identify exposures, we're probably not addressing them. It could be something as simple as, if we have 2 or 3 different types of buses within our organization, do we have a process to ensure people are cross-trained on them before they start taking them out? Because if they've been operating a Volvo for the past 9 months, and then they switch to an MCI, are the controls 100% the same? No, it goes back to muscle memory. They're going to operate based off of the Volvo. They're going to be distracted. The last category is environment. This one's a little more difficult to change, but you can modify to meet your needs. With environment, think of something as simple as a route. If we're picking people up at a hotel 2 or 3 times a week and we have to take them a few miles down the road, and when we leave the hotel, we have to cross a 2-lane highway. Within 50 feet of each other, you have a stop sign, you have a stop light. Where do most people go? Most people go to the stop sign because they control the stop and go. What's the safer environment? It's the stop light. Why? Because it's a controlled environment. Unfortunately, what typically happens, drivers continue to take the stop sign. One day, they fail to see someone coming down the road. They pull out, they get T-boned. That's when we make changes in our company where we say it's mandatory that you take the stop light rather than the stop sign. Why aren't we identifying these types of exposures proactively rather than waiting until after we have losses? Environment could also be something as simple as equipment, material. How often do you walk into a shop and you think to yourself, we're setting people up for failure. There's stuff, there's tripping hazards all over. You go back to the example of equipment with the tire cage. If we have a tire cage on the opposite end of the shop compared to where the tire work takes place, are people going to use that tire cage? No. I was at a location 2 or 3 years ago. We were conducting a mock OSHA audit. And we were in the shop. They had an abrasive wheel. They had an eye wash station. That's a good idea. Unfortunately, they were right next to each other. From an efficiency standpoint, that's great. You get something in your eye, you're next to the eye wash station. But guess what was in the eye wash station? Metal shavings. Those are things that we want to try to identify throughout the organization before they lead to loss. So with this, let's use a simple example of John Doe. He's been driving a Volvo for the past 9 months. He comes in one day and his vehicle is not working, so he jumps into an MCI. He goes to turn the turn signal on, but he accidentally turns the windshield wipers on. So he looks down to try to correct the situation. Next thing you know, he rear-ends another vehicle. Where would it fall within these 4 different categories? A lot of people want to say right away, we need to put John Doe through training on following distance. But is that going to correct the real issue? Absolutely, it's not going to. I'd say contributing factors are training under the people category. We probably led them improperly. We didn't set them up for success. But it goes back to processes. Why don't we have a process to ensure people are cross-trained on the different vehicles throughout our organization? I have customers tell me all the time, well, in orientation, we familiarize them with every vehicle within our fleet. Well, 2 years later, do you think they're going to know how to operate that vehicle just as safely as when they were originally trained? No. I can't say it more often than not. Or I can't say it enough. Muscle memory. We need to ensure people are familiar with the vehicles that they're operating. Otherwise, it's going to result in loss. Oops. So this is a fairly simplistic method to the root cause. It's known as the 5 whys. Has everyone heard of this before? You continue to ask why until you get to a granular enough level where you've identified what went wrong. And we call it the 5 whys, but you may have to ask why 3 times. You may have to ask why 10 times. I compare it to an onion. You have multiple layers of an onion. Every time you peel a layer back, that's a contributing factor. We want to get to the core of the onion because that's the root cause. We have a fairly simple example where the driver was injured falling out of the vehicle. I want to know why. Well, the driver's foot slipped while walking down the stairs. Well, it's due to improper footwear. Well, we realized there's no formal footwear policy in place. And why? Management assumed employees would wear proper footwear. It goes back to, do we ever assume that employees know how to perform the job safely? We do. So what do we need to do? We need to implement a footwear policy. We need to communicate that, and we need to hold employees accountable. Because if we don't do those 3 things, we're not setting anyone up for success. If we just implement a footwear policy and give it to new hires, well, that's great that they know we have a policy. What about all current employees? But if we identify that maybe we have a lack of policy in place and we assume employees know how to perform their job, let's take a step back even farther. Where else do we not have policies that we expect employees to know how to perform their job safely? When you identify the root cause of loss, again, take a step back farther because there are probably other system failures throughout your organization. Where else are we assuming things? So this next slide, I'm not going to go into too granular of a level, but everyone's probably seen the safety management cycle by the FMCSA. This is a great resource to use. It's on the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration's website. As you're going through the model I talked about, or if you're going through the 5 whys, pull this up. It's a systematic approach to identify what system failures exist in our organization. It talks about policies and procedures, roles and responsibilities, qualifications and hiring, safety training, communication, meaningful actions. If you work your way throughout this cycle, you're probably also going to find things that went wrong when it comes to a loss. Has everyone seen this before? I know Danielle has, being from the FMCSA. Anyone else? Has anyone used it before in the past? If not, type the safety management cycle into Google with FMCSA and it'll come right up. They have one for each individual basic. But you can take them farther than basics. You can apply it to any type of loss. And the methodology behind it is going to help you get to the root cause. So we talked about root cause, different processes to get to it, things that you want to look at, probing questions. And we're not going to do that without conducting a thorough investigation. I can't stress enough, don't overlook those minor incidents. Because why? They're the biggest opportunity to make changes throughout our organization before we have that large loss. It bothers me when I go into companies and I realize they have a safety incentive program, or they have a disciplinary program that's based off of severity. Over $1,000 in financial value, we put you through remedial training. Well, if you hit a 1991 Honda Civic compared to a 2010 Mercedes-Benz, which one do you think is going to be more expensive? Obviously the Mercedes, but is it still that same unsafe behavior that probably took place that resulted in the accident? It absolutely is. Again, investigate things thoroughly, get witness statements, cross-reference documentation, go back and look to see when's the last time that they went through training. And after you determine what the root cause is, implement the changes throughout the organization. Assign the task to someone and verify that they have been implemented, because unfortunately sometimes we come up with great solutions, but 6 months down the road, we realize we never implemented them due to operations or time constraints. We didn't have time. The last thing we want to do is realize we have another loss and then say, oh, we never implemented the solution that we identified 6 months ago. And the last thing is continuously monitor the things that you put in place. If we implement changes, we want to verify it's effective. Maybe 30, 60, 90 days out, verify that employees are following the changes that we implemented, or that they're successful, or we're not continuing to see the same types of losses or the same types of near misses. So we have an activity. We're going to have to work in groups. I'd like maybe each table to work together and each row back there to work together. What I'm going to do is give you a police report. You have to determine preventable, non-preventable, and what the root cause is. If you have enough information based off of what I give you, great. Shout out the root cause and we'll discuss it together. If you feel like you need additional information, tell me, and if I have it up here, I'll provide it to you. Again, this is all about cross-referencing documentation to get to those underlying causation factors. But what I also want you to do, not only identify the root cause, I want you to pick out red flags that could potentially increase the severity of a loss. And I'm going to leave this model up here so you can work through the different categories as you investigate it. So I'll give several accident reports per group, and the reason I do that is I want to ensure that everyone's collaborating and you're not working by yourself. You're welcome. See, I need to get to the root cause of that. I almost tripped. Yep. That's Ohio. Things are a little more simplistic sometimes. If you guys could work together, I appreciate it. And I'll be walking around so I can answer questions. And if you need additional documentation, again, I can provide it to you. I get people ask me a lot, just give me all the documentation from the beginning, but I can't do that because it would defeat the purpose of the activity. You want another one?